Welcome to the new episode of the ICAS Expert Voices Initiative. My name is Yulin Zhang. I'm the Research Associate and the Manager of the Trade and Technology Program at the Institute for China-American Studies. Today is our second episode for the Global Trade Intention series, and we're very happy to have Mr. Sullivan from the United States-China Business Council to discuss the ongoing trends in the trade turbulence from a U.S. perspective. Mr. Sullivan, I am very happy to have you.
Likewise.
Mr. Sullivan is the Vice President of Business Advisory Service of the USCBC, where he oversees USCBC's research and analysis for member companies, and you can find the details of his bios on our website and also on USCBC website. So let's jump towards the big picture.
Sure.
So we just had the United States and China announce that they're going to formally extend the trade truce for another 90 days. That goes all the way till the very end of this year. What do you think, how would you assess the current state of the U.S.-China trade relations, and how would you say the likelihood of both sides reaching to a final trade deal that we're no longer see a lot of uncertainties and turbulence by the end of this year?
Well, that's a great question, and first, thank you so much, Elon, for having me. It's my absolute pleasure to participate in this podcast and have the opportunity to speak with you. So, I guess maybe we could kind of start just assessing the state of the bilateral talks. Obviously, the discussions in Stockholm had concluded in late July, and the good news is we're in a period of relative stability, right? I think both governments are prioritizing stability. Neither side wants to provoke the other or get dragged into a new round of tit-for-tat escalatory tariffs or export controls. And I think a unique feature of these discussions is that unlike the first trade war in 2018-2019, the U.S. had levied restrictions on China, and levied tariffs, and the Chinese side had responded with kind of in-kind tariffs, 25% against the Chinese, 25% against the U.S. So it was a tit-for-tat type of dynamic. Now, this time around, the Chinese government has certainly has avoided or attempted to avoid escalating against the Americans, but they've used asymmetric restrictions or asymmetric responses against U.S. interests. Recall back to the February 2 fentanyl tariffs and the March 4 fentanyl tariffs. The Chinese had not only responded with their own set of tariffs against a finite number of industries, but they had enacted what we call non-tariff barriers against agriculture, against other types of industries that are important to the U.S. economy. And I think the Chinese have done their homework assessing what are the pain points of the U.S., and they've kind of targeted those pain points. And so that's like where we are today in this period of stability. I think is partly a function of the Chinese demonstrating a willingness to escalate or to perhaps give the Americans pause before the Americans levy more restrictions. And so, we obviously, after Liberation Day in April 2, the tariffs had skyrocketed to exceed 145%. And then we had the May 12 discussions in Geneva. There was a 90-day pause there, right? And then we kind of moved on from tariffs after Geneva a little bit, and we moved into a brief export control war where the Chinese had essentially cut off access to rare earth elements and magnets, which are just, anyone who's following this space now is an armchair geologist, but these are obviously very important inputs to U.S. industry, and they had essentially brought supply chains and production for some very prominent American companies to a standstill as the Chinese side had restricted the flow of these rare earths. And so we had this mini export control war, and then the two sides got together again in London, where they had hashed it out and had come to some sort of agreement on export controls. And then fast forward to late July, they met again in Stockholm. most of these discussions, I think, apart from the Geneva talks, where there was an official readout, there was not an official readout in London. So it's kind of difficult to assess from standing on the outside, observing what are the priorities, what are the areas of discussion. We're all kind of reading the tea leaves and extrapolating information here and there, but I think the overriding priority right now is to maintain stability and not up the ante, because President Trump is, I think, very, very focused on executing a deal with China. He's said that numerous times. He's truthed it numerous times. So his administration is snapping to that agenda. And I think to your point, or to your question about what will we see in the next 90 days, so we have a 90-day pause on tariffs again, and that expires, I believe, November 12, or November 11. So I think the smart money is on a potential leader-to-leader meeting. Initially, there was speculation that President Trump would travel to China, do a state visit, right, meet with President Xi there. It seems like there's probably a little bit less interest in that right now, and perhaps more interest in a meeting on the sidelines of APEC in Seoul, which is late October, early November. And so, if and when there is a leader meeting, there has to be some sort of announcement, right? They can't just be meeting and nothing happens. There needs to be something new. And the latest that we are hearing is we suspect if there is a meeting, there would be some sort of announcement on the framework for guiding future negotiations, which would ultimately lead to a deal. But we're still several months away from that, and I don't necessarily anticipate a kind of a grand bargain or a phase one style deal being announced in Seoul if there is a meeting. I think that type of outcome would be several months later, probably maybe late 2025 or the beginning of the next year.
Since you mentioned phase one deal, I think something just recently happened is quite interesting. That just hours before President Trump announced that the extension, he also posted on social media that he asked the Chinese to quadruple the purchase of soybean. So, as we walk through the whole timeline since Liberation Day, we see that the two sides started from a tit-for-tat tariff war, and then we move on to export control. There's rare earths in discussion. There's also a bunch of other things. Now it seems like we're going back to purchasing commitment. Is there any clarity, if I may say, that we can actually find from the Trump administration's policy or agenda?
Yeah.
Or do we really can we confidently say that both sides understand each other's agenda and priorities clearly so far, that they can continue to work out towards that potential framework to reach a final deal?
That's a great question. So let me answer the second part of your question first. I think presently it doesn't seem like there's a coherent strategy right now. And I'll tell you why, because so much of the oxygen has been sucked up by discussions on tariffs and export controls, on rare earths and U.S. export controls. There's been so much focus on these two things that there's been little room for discussion on kind of the more, I would say, more challenging yet more impactful policies, on market access restrictions, on China's industrial policies, kind of these structural issues that during Trump 1.0 they initially had prioritized. IP is another example. So I don't think there's been a lot of eye to eye between the two sides on those issues, and I suspect there's been some preliminary discussions on U.S. concerns about overcapacity in China, and that's probably maybe a little bit of a less sensitive topic, or maybe an easier topic to discuss with the Chinese, because they themselves are trying to address overcapacity in their economy. We obviously have President Xi focused on the anti-involution competition and the mismatch between supply and demand. So the Chinese are definitely making all the rhetorical gestures and rhetorical acknowledgement of overcapacity. So I think there's been some discussion there. But I think just in terms of the stepping back a little bit, the president's goals, obviously he's very concerned about the trade imbalance. If there's one issue that President Trump has been very consistent on, even well before he had assumed office in 2017, he was very fixated on the trade imbalance between the U.S. and its trading partners, and I think that concern is definitely driving a lot of the negotiations, or at least that will manifest itself in some of the asks that the U.S. side is going to raise with China, and that's where the purchase commitments come in. Obviously, we had purchase commitments in phase one, primarily in agriculture and energy and aircraft, and I suspect that we will see something similar this time around. But the kind of the sticking point is I don't really see the Chinese side willing to discuss seriously any purchase commitments until the fentanyl tariffs come down. Right, there's a 20% tariff on all Chinese imports in response to U.S. concerns about fentanyl and China's role in the illicit fentanyl trade, and then there's a retaliatory tariff on U.S. ag exports to China, soybeans, sorghum, etc. So I think the U.S. fentanyl tariffs would need to come down, and then subsequently the retaliatory Chinese tariffs would come down on U.S. ag products. Then I think there would be the conditions. To borrow a term from the Chinese side, the conditions have to be right. So I think that's the main sticking point. But if they can overcome the impasse on fentanyl, then there would pave the way for some type of managed trade, as we call it.
Great point. I think agriculture has been always been one of the sticking point between U.S. and China, and it is really not just the White House that's really worried about agriculture. We are also seeing a lot of congressional lawmakers who are really concerned about the ongoing trade situation. So far, I think it is safe to just argue that the White House is completely behind the wheel when it comes to U.S.-China trade negotiation. But we are also seeing that even since the Biden administration's time, Congress has become more and more not just vocal but also constructively pushing forward legislations or making themselves heard in terms of how they want to reshape U.S. trade policies specifically with China. Do you think that Congress is potentially going to play a bigger role in the future? And could that really help facilitate a great conditions when the conditions right for the Chinese, or not?
So great question on the role of Congress in influencing U.S. trade policy towards China. I think as you had alluded to earlier in the discussion, the Congress, the president's advisors inside the executive branch and inside the White House are all very deferential to the president on his policy towards China, and I think frankly his trade policy towards most of our trading partners. And going into the administration late last year, earlier this year, there was a considerable concern, at least on our part, that Congress was going to make a real push to repeal China's permanent normal trade relation status, or PNTR. Doing so would immediately raise tariffs on Chinese imports to above 60%, around 60%, kind of trade-weighted average tariff. So we were quite focused on that and engaging Congress on that. And then when President Trump came to power, I think it quickly became quite clear that Congress is not going to get ahead of the president, especially on China. And the PNTR as an example, I think they kind of, the Republicans in Congress in particular, kind of backed down on PNTR because they did not want to tie the president's hands behind his back and remove any source of negotiating room that he could have with China. So I think that holds true across nearly all commercial and trade fronts with China. We haven't seen any significant legislation. It's early days in the 119th Congress. We're 6 months, 7 months into it. There's been legislative proposals, but we haven't seen any actual rulemaking from Congress on China that I can think of. So I think that will continue as long as the negotiations are ongoing. And so that's the kind of current state of play. There are some concerns, at least from our perspective, like on biosecure, for example, which would impact a lot of our American healthcare companies. But some of that stuff could get folded into the annual defense appropriations, right, the NDAA. But it's difficult to see Congress really making a mark, contravening the president's will on China. However, that being said, maybe longer term, on the flip side is if the negotiations go south and we kind of end up in a period like we were in 2020, right after the pandemic, where the president was sanctioning Chinese interests, at a very rapid rate. So if things go south with China, there's a whole list of restrictions, draft form that not only Congress has teed up, but the executive branch. We talk about outbound to a certain extent, export controls, other types of restrictions, sanctions. So that's the risk. If things go bad, then Congress would be much more, I think, forward-leaning and active in rulemaking on China.
Great point. Actually, it's something very interesting that came to us as ICAS having a special project tracking congressional legislations over the years. First of all, I think it's great to hear that, for now, I think Congress and the President has a consensus that they still want to push for successful U.S.-China trade deal.
Mm-hmm.
But like you said, we are actually seeing that there's quite a lot of proposed legislation.
Yeah.
For the 119th Congress, the reason why they still stayed at the proposed stage, just being introduced or merely just passed one chamber, is because primarily their effort has been occupied by the one big beautiful bill.
Indeed.
But what had happened, during the very end of the 118th Congress and the very beginning of the 119th Congress, is that we're seeing a significant increase in finance, capital market related legislations. That there are lawmakers who consistently call for more supervision, more screening over Chinese investment in the United States. In addition to the good old outbound investment talk, are we seeing that potentially U.S. and China entering a stage of a de facto decoupling in the finance world, even though there are other ties in other areas?
Some observers have noted that early on in the administration, we had a tariff war, right, and then followed by an export control war, and then I think the next front, at least speculatively, the next front is a financial war. And obviously there's been some policies enacted under Trump 1.0 targeting Chinese companies that are listed on U.S. exchanges, namely the Holding Foreign Companies Accounting Act, and then you had the PCAOB audit inspections, right, where the Biden administration come to an agreement with China. So I feel like the delisting Chinese companies, there is a framework in place that is being led by the PCAOB, and that seems to be working. I don't necessarily see that being undone in the immediate future. There has been some effort at the SEC to take another look at Chinese issuers or Chinese companies listed here through their own rules, and that was that had been published about a month and a half ago. But perhaps what's going on is that, again, Congress and some of the more hawkish elements against China are maybe perhaps laying the groundwork for more active rulemaking, and that could be one explanation. Another kind of, I would say, explanation is there is certainly some disagreement, no doubt, between Congress and the White House on the direction of China policy so far, and particularly on chips. You probably saw Chairman Molnar of the Select Committee had gone on record, disagreeing with the White House's decision to sell H-20s to China. So there's some perhaps maybe emerging signs of fissures or cracks selectively, but I think in instances like that, it's more reps are signaling their dissatisfaction. But I still think the overriding principle is they're not going to get out in front of the president. But the financial front in particular, I wouldn't say we're in a de facto financial decoupling with China. Certainly, FDI is down. In fact, it's down around 90% over the past 4 years. But we've seen some
passive financial flows going to China. That was really prevalent in around 2022, 23 when Chinese bond yields are more attractive than Treasury yields here. That's kind of reversed a little bit, right? There's a big spread between Treasuries and Chinese government sovereign debt, but we are seeing some passive flows going back to China, and I think some of it is they're chasing potential IPOs in Hong Kong, right? The CATL IPO in May was, I think, a good test case. It was, I think, quite attractive. There was a lot of uptake on that, from what I understand. So you are, and on the Chinese side, you do have the regulatory framework, Bond Connect, and these other instruments that do allow foreign investors to participate in China's fiscal policies and debt issuances, bond issuances. So there's no real tangible restriction on the Chinese side, and there's no, certainly on the U.S. side, there's the outbound investment mechanism, but that only pertains to private equity, venture capital, and corporate investment, greenfield. It does not apply to public equities. It does apply to certain debt instruments, but I would have to kind of check my notes on that. So there, just lastly, perhaps on outbound, no doubt there's been lots of questions about the direction the administration wants to take on investment security and economic security with the outbound rule. And obviously we haven't seen any new developments on that front. There was some speculation that Treasury was going to expand the outbound investment screening mechanism, and I think that was a reaction to the administration's America First investment policy that was published in February, where they had kind of detailed what they're going to do on outbound and on CFIUS. But we haven't seen any action yet. And again, I think it's because we're in this pause period with the negotiations.
So I'm glad that you talk about investment to China. Those American companies have been at the forefront carrying out these investments over the past few decades, and I think USCB has done tremendous work over years to facilitate that tie. But let's move from policy to more operational front.
Sure.
Since you have a lot of members who's definitely very concerned, or keeping an eye out on the ongoing trend in U.S.-China relations. But what to them most important thing is the business down on the ground in China. What do you think are the main issues? Because we have been hearing a lot about China has become uninvestable. China has become the Chinese business environment has going worse and worse. The usual talks we've been hearing over the years in the U.S. How do these companies actually feel in China? What are their major complaints? What are their major concerns?
No doubt. Good question. Perhaps to your point about China being uninvestable, I think that goes back to the Biden administration. There was some rhetoric from the U.S. government about that, and maybe that had pertained to the state or their perception of the state of the Chinese economy, more so than the business environment. Albeit there are concerns about certain rules like the anti-espionage law and things like that. But so every year we do publish a survey of our member companies to kind of gauge
business sentiment and understand their operating challenges in China. And we publish a top 10 list of challenges. And for anyone who's managed a business in China or who tracks these issues, the business and commercial policies in China, the top 10 challenges would not come as a surprise to them. There's a kind of a core set of recurring policy obstacles facing American companies in China, namely that stem from China's industrial policies and its domestic substitution policies, and certainly they impact certain sectors more than others, right? High tech, automotive, materials, basically anything that was in the Made in China 2025 plan that came out in 2015. So these kind of strategic industries, but kind of ironically, that's where a lot of the investment is in China. The kind of total FDI stock of U.S. FDI stock in China, a large proportion of it is in industrial manufacturing, automotive supply chains that serve these sectors, and perhaps 3 or 4 or 5 years ago, more so in the high tech, we're seeing kind of I don't want to say a decrease, but perhaps more concerns among tech companies in China about their future there. So there's palpable concern about whether the American firms will they be welcome in China in 5 years? Will they be pushed out of the market? Will domestic competitors usurp market share from them, which is happening? And so when you hear the Chinese government speak about welcoming foreign investment and rectifying policies to attract foreign investment, I think they are genuine. And the central government in particular, I think, has, if you look at the data in our member survey, the companies recognize that the government, central government in particular, has made significant efforts to increase market access on paper, right? China's regulatory and legal systems on paper are, I think, very modern, right? Administratively, China has modernized itself in the past 10 years. Laws and regulations are easily searchable, right? You can, industry regulators regularly publish rules for comment, draft rules for comment. So there is, at least on the surface, a higher degree of transparency, but you dig beneath the surface, there's a lot of what we call window guidance going on in China. In Chinese, I think it's a kotou tongzhi. And there's also a lot of secret documents, Document 79, Document 551. These are state-led directives instructing Chinese companies to purchase from Chinese suppliers for the purposes of government procurement and state-owned enterprise procurement. And these are very large markets for American firms in China. And when you have an industry regulator in China or a powerful government or party organization quietly, instructing the market to not buy from American firms, that has a detrimental effect, not only on sentiment, but just on companies' bottom lines.
So I think that leads to my next question. I think somehow ties back to the overcapacity we mentioned, and also the government instructions. China has recently released its new policy to somehow address overcapacity and then try to stop the race to the bottom competition within its own market, what they call the financial.
Okay.
I'm just very curious about, from an American business perspective, would that kind of effort be welcoming, or is there any particular other specific efforts that they are wishing to see from the Chinese side to improve or grant more access or potentially create more business opportunity?
Well, certainly. I think that the government has paid considerable attention to stamping out overcapacity, to putting a floor under prices, and to counter involution or and competition in China, and I think depending on implementation, that could be a welcome development for foreign firms. And if you look at some of the data from our survey, the companies are clearly facing falling prices in their sector. We had asked our members, to what extent are you seeing overcapacity in your sector? It's about 42% have already experienced it, and there's another portion of companies that expect to see it soon. So we have nearly half of the companies are dealing with overcapacity, and of those that are dealing with overcapacity, nearly all of them are seeing falling prices in their sector. So that, that's chemicals, that's automotive, that's certain types of, obviously, medical devices, and that's not necessarily because of overcapacity, but because of China's volume-based procurement rules, nonetheless. So it's a real concern, and historically, American firms in China have been able to command a premium on price, right? They've created a moat around themselves, offering superior technology and after-sales service, and that's enabled them to charge a pretty nice margin that they get. But if your competitors are continually cutting prices around you, that's going to put pressure on your prices as well, and that's a real concern for companies. So if the government is addressing deflation in a kind of constructive way, where it's not just a one-off campaign that they're paying attention to it for 6 months and then declare victory, I'm not sure how helpful that will be. But if they're actually attempting to address the underlying causes of deflation and overcapacity in China, which Beijing has an official campaign called the National Unified Market, right, where they are trying to curb provincial, local governments from competing with each other by offering incentives, by making sweetheart deals with local companies, and erecting barriers. There are a lot of market access barriers in China, not just for U.S. or foreign firms, but for Chinese companies. It's hard to do cross-provincial business in many sectors. So if they're serious about addressing those root causes, and also there's a mismatch between supply and demand, and that's a little bit of a trickier area, I think, or issue for China to deal with. It pertains to their political economy, and directing a lot of state funding to manufacturing rather than to households. And I just don't see the Chinese side, sending stimulus checks to Chinese households. They like to see bridges, they like to see buildings, and tangible things. So that's trickier. But one thing that they are doing, and this is not a new development, but their MIT in particular.
So recently, USCBC led a delegation to Beijing that met with senior Chinese officials, including Wang Yi, and other officials from PBOC and commerce, etc. Is there any? I'm sure that some of the issues we just discussed have been addressed to the Chinese side as well. Is there any concrete signal from the Chinese side suggesting potentially which way they're heading at, what effort they might to put into to address this issue of concern? And how would you assess the response? Is there a genuine or candid response, or potentially their hands are also tied on their end?
The message on the economy, the message from Beijing was they were very uncharacteristically candid, I think, about the economy. They were saying, yeah, sure, we're going to grow around 5%, but we have this 2.8% GDP deflator that will bring down growth, real GDP growth, to 2.5% or so, and growth will be uneven, right? There will be certain sectors that are doing very well, other sectors that are perhaps underperforming, and that was probably maybe the first time that the officials in Beijing were that forthcoming and just clear-eyed about the state of the economy. I think year on year things have improved. This time last year versus now, and perhaps that's given some cover or space for the Chinese policymakers to be a little bit more honest about where the economy is going. And just on foreign investment and addressing the concerns and the issues of American companies. And let me just say this: it's not operating in China is very challenging, but it's also very rewarding, right? And I don't want to make this discussion all about the challenges, but when the central policymakers, they were, I think, very responsive, very much, very interested in hearing about company challenges, about the sectoral challenges, and they had, following these meetings, they assigned their deputies and their teams to follow up with us about that. So I think there's a clear desire to attract foreign investment, right? That's really on top of mind for Chinese policymakers, and like I said, the FDI numbers are down substantially, and so I think that's a concern of theirs, no doubt. But there's always, that's not a recent phenomenon. This is as old hat in China. There's always a disconnect between center and the periphery, right? They are very much pro-investment, all this stuff, and then sometimes the provincial or local level regulators, depending on where you are in China, are not getting the message, right? And that goes back to what we were discussing earlier in this national unified market stuff. But it's always a challenge for the central government, and I don't envy them. They have a tough job to force through change and to see that their policies are implemented consistently and fairly across regions, and that's a challenge for them.
It seems to me that the interesting thing is that there are a lot of issues and concerns on both sides. I think U.S. companies are trying to find more profit and opportunities in China, while China has a dual front fight to do. On the one hand, they need to clear up the less competitive companies, and the other hand, they want to also maintain some of the advantages in their very competitive areas. So no doubt there will be efforts and commitment from the Chinese government to try to clear up all of these things. But also I want to ask, if potentially they manage to clear up the less competitive parts of things, well, Chinese companies are undoubtedly going to compete with the American counterparts. Would you say that is some kind of format of business environment that the American companies will welcome? How would they, see, or how would they judge the fairness of that competition?
So I think your question speaks to the competitive landscape in China and the extent to which American companies welcome competition from their Chinese counterparts and competitors. So if you look at the contours of the China market, from the rising capabilities of Chinese companies to shifting consumption patterns among consumers, and the rapid adoption of digital tools and social media marketing, China's market is hyper competitive, and you oftentimes hear business people in China compare China to a gym, right, or a fitness center where you go and you are there in the market, you're competing and you're working out, you're getting strong, you're getting buff, and you're getting buff so that you can go compete in the match, which is the global stage, right? And yeah, there's a lot of truth to that, certainly. But I think American companies, they are some of the best in the world, right? They have best practices, international standard for management practices, cutting edge technologies, institutional history. Many of our member companies are over 100 years old, and they've been operating in markets globally for decades. So they have a lot to offer. And if they're able to compete on a level playing field in China, I think they would do very well. And I'm not suggesting that there's inherent anti-competitive features in the marketplace that that the government is told, or Chinese companies are adhering to anti-competitive practices all the time. I mean, from a business perspective, there is this full-on competition, right? And if you ask any general manager in China managing a U.S. or European or operation, and you ask them what is one issue that keeps you awake at night, it's not U.S. export controls, it's not tariffs, it's how do I compete with my Chinese competitors, and will I be viable in the marketplace 3, 4, 5 years from now? And that really speaks to the rapid advancement of Chinese companies and the technological ascendancy of Chinese companies. And certainly there's no doubt there's quite a bit of state support for that, preferential loans and subsidies, but there are a lot of private Chinese companies that don't want subsidies, they don't want to get involved in that. They're competing purely on their own intellectual property and their own market talents, right? And so I think that if that's part of our job, is to ensure that there is fair competition, and it goes back to those recurring issues I mentioned earlier. But there's always going to be an element of protectionism in China, as you had alluded to earlier. These companies are starting to go global, and they're starting to compete with our companies globally. And there's data in our survey that suggests some serious anxieties about losing global market share to Chinese companies in third markets. And that's why we, as the business community here, we are advocating for policies in the U.S. that promote our competitiveness globally. And the main kind of there's lots of discussion about, okay, why are U.S. companies in China? It's no longer a low cost competitive market. It's no longer a source for purely a source for exports to the U.S. What is the business proposition? What's the value proposition of being in China? And one common thread across industries is they need to be in China not only to keep an eye on their competitors, what they're doing, but also to absorb innovations in the domestic ecosystem, and to better themselves so that they are in a good, advantageous position to compete against Chinese companies.
It seems like there's a lot of homework on both sides to do, both for Chinese business and American businesses, and also for the two governments. I want to just conclude our interview with potentially a concluding thought from you. So what do you envision the future for U.S.-China businesses look like? Is it more kind of like a competition, and we're trying to winner takes all type of things, and we compete in the global market share? If you win, you take all, and I have to try my best to defend my own home ground? Or is there potentially new areas that we can still develop and try to make the best use of those potentials?
Well, I think that the China market is increasingly accessible only to large companies. You don't see a whole lot of small, medium-sized enterprises, certainly not as many as you used to in China. And I'm speaking about foreign small, medium-sized enterprises. And for various reasons, perhaps they don't have the resources they need to engage the government, right? Perhaps they don't have the resources they need to protect their intellectual property, or just to generally compete against Chinese companies. Smaller companies are a bit more price sensitive, whereas larger companies can kind of absorb fluctuations in cost and price and things like that. So there's a clear, I would say, trend towards the larger companies that are continuing to be successful in China, and I think that will be the trajectory going forward. And U.S. companies are like like I said, they're smart, they're creative. They have been operating with restrictions for 7 or 8 years now, and I think the operating assumption is that the restrictions will get tighter, and the competition will get stiffer, and so they are going to have to adjust accordingly. And I have full faith and confidence in their ability to execute on their corporate strategies to deal with those risks, so that they can uncover and capitalize on new opportunities. And no doubt, a lot of the companies are. There's still lots of potential in tertiary cities in China on the consumer side, and the government. There are supportive policies in China that are lifting incomes in among rural residents, and I think that's an area for consumer facing companies. The tech companies are admittedly more pessimistic about their future in China, and we have data on that in our survey. But so long as they are generating a margin that is equal to or greater than their global average, and they're not legally boxed out of the market, I think they will continue to operate there for the foreseeable future. So back to your question about the future of American firms in China. In the kind of the short term, companies are taking different postures, right? The data in our survey suggests the majority of the companies are kind of in a holding pattern right now. They're waiting for more clarity on the direction of the trade policies and more confidence in the economy going forward. And then there's another section or a segment of companies that are really doubling down on the domestic market. And you've all heard the term in China for China. These are the big industrial players, healthcare, medical device, industrial manufacturing. They are now, as a result of some of the trade policies, the tariffs and the Chinese retaliatory tariffs in particular, there's I would say about a third of our membership, their overriding objective for investing in China this year is to localize sourcing and localize production, so to mitigate risks from U.S.-China tensions. And so perhaps that's an unexpected outcome of the tariffs. I think perhaps the objective of the tariffs here was to reshore production, and certainly our companies are doing that, no doubt. There's been lots of announcements about boosting production capabilities and footprints here, but they're also boosting their local sourcing and production in China to serve the China market, and also to serve not just China but rest of the world and in Asia Pacific, and finding that kind of that advantageous and cost effective supply chain, right? So, and then lastly, there's, I would say, a much smaller minority of firms that are preparing to maybe diversify or unwind some of their operations in China. And the data point this year is about a quarter of the firms had indicated they've relocated certain operations outside China. And that doesn't necessarily entail a mass exit, but it entails a degree of divestiture and a degree of scaling down, whether it's temporary or permanent, but we are definitely seeing an increase in that.
It seems like during this time full of uncertainties and potentially opportunities, you can choose to hold, you can choose to adapt, you can also choose to diversify, but it seems like things are never going back to the old way.
Well, it's just a function of China's the maturity of its economy, and China's at a certain point in the development curve now, than a different point than it was 10 years ago, or a different point than it was 20 years ago. And look, this is not the first foreign market that American firms have invested in. They have that experience, and they have very talented staff in China that are advising headquarters. Maybe I could just speak a little bit about that, and just in terms of the perhaps some areas that American firms could improve is this kind of headquarter local operations communication. So it's but not necessarily a new phenomenon. I've worked in China. I've worked for American firms in China. I've worked at the local operation there, and you're off. You're off in your own world a little bit, right? You have your corporate leaders coming in, once a quarter, once every half year, and you're forming connections. But you're kind of you're not. They're not there, and you're not interacting with them as regularly as you would be if you are based in headquarters. And so Chinese companies don't really have that problem, right? Chinese companies, their headquarters are in China, their corporate decision makers are in China, so they're inherently just faster to market. They're faster decision making than their American peers. And I think over the past, and just anecdotally, and then there's some survey data and other chambers that do this. There's I think perhaps maybe a growing gap between HQ and local operations, particularly on big decisions. You're sitting here in the U.S. You're reading the Wall Street Journal. You're reading the Financial Times. You're benchmarking with other companies, and a lot of the information you're getting, particularly in press, is all about risk, right? It's all about the risks of investing in China, and it's not, that definitely molds mindsets. And you have on the flip side, you have your managers in China. They are thinking about opportunity. I need more investment, so I can compete with my local competitors. I need support from HQ. And whereas HQ is perhaps maybe reticent to allocate new investments to China because of the risks. So you do see that disconnect there. And I certainly feel like if U.S. firms want to maintain their position in China, they need to, it's not all the companies, but just generally the companies need to kind of address that.
It seems like there needs to be a lot of talking happening, both between Chinese government and the U.S. government, between Chinese business and U.S. businesses, and even between the U.S. headquarters and their Chinese local businesses.
Indeed.
I think that would serve as a very well conclusion. Thank you again, Mr. Sullivan, for taking this interview. And we will continue to interview experts on global trade issues in our forthcoming episode, and stay tuned. Thank you.